The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len B.A. And with me today is Scott Gale. Scott Gale is on the board of the Monterey History and Art Association. He is the curator of the Jo Mora Cartographer exhibit, which is currently on display at the Stanton Center on Custom House Plaza in Monterey. For several months, Scott has been planning the upcoming Jo Mora Gathering weekend to be held October 5th and 6th in Monterey, along with Peter Hiller. Peter is the author of the book, The Life and Times of Jo Mora. Scott has a passion for art, no doubt inherited. His grandfather was Donald Teague, a highly regarded Carmel-based illustrator for the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's, as well as an outstanding fine artist. His great-grandfather was Harry Timmins, another highly regarded illustrator during the golden era of illustration. Scott is a semi-retired physician and lives in Carmel with his wife, Nina. Scott Gale, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Len, it's great to be with you and with the listeners.
Yeah, and I'm excited to learn about Jo Mora because someone that I had never heard of until we connected. And, I think a lot of us have probably seen a piece of Jo Mora's work without realizing that who the artist was or what he had done. Can you tell us a little bit about Jo Mora?
Yeah, sure. Well, just, first of all, I think you're exactly right. His art surrounds us, and a lot of us have seen it without realizing that, who did it. I just had that experience shopping down on Pacific an hour ago. I showed somebody a cart, and they're like, "Oh, I know who that is. I've seen that."
Right?
Or a cart being a map. So, Jo Mora was a phenomenal artist. He was, in his time, called the Renaissance Man of the West, in the sense that there was virtually nothing he could not do. And he was born in 1876 in Uruguay, and his father was a Spanish sculptor. His mother was French. And the Mora family moved to the East Coast, Boston, when Jo was young. And so he grew up in an arts household and was taught sculpture by his dad, started out cartooning initially back east, and eventually headed out west. And in terms of his art making, I think while he was alive, he was mostly known as a sculptor. Today, we arguably best remember him for his maps or carts that he created. And he made about 18 of them, 15 to 18 while he was alive. And then some people after he passed in 1947 kind of riffed off things he had done and colorized them or whatnot. So there's a total of 22 of them today.
Wow. And these are, when we say cart or map, these are the kind like we see that are sort of, I'll call them stylized, where you kind of see things in perspective, right? Like they have illustrations and embellishments on the maps.
Absolutely. So for our region, he did 3, for example. He did one of the Monterey Peninsula in 1926, which was his first kind of large format map or cart. And he did a second one, just a 17-mile drive in 1935 after 17-mile drive was revamped. Initially, it began and ended at the Hotel Del Monte in Monterey, which is now the Naval Postgraduate School. And with the impending completion of Highway 1 from north to south, Sam Morse, who owned the Del Monte Properties Company, decided he wanted to revamp 17-mile drive to make it a closed circuit like it is today. He was afraid that too much north-south traffic would just divert over onto 17-mile drive and ruin the experience for folks. So anyways, Morse commissioned a second map or cart in 1935 of 17-mile drive. And then Mora did a third one just of Carmel. And so they're maps in the sense that they're accurate, and you could actually use them for navigational purposes to, get about. But they're pictorial maps, and so there's all sorts of embellishments in them. They might be animals or ships or cartoons, and they're just, we're in radio, so we can't show folks, what they look like. But if you go online and just type in Jo Mora, M-O-R-A, and then cart or map, and cart is C-A-R-T-E, they'll come up readily, and you'll get a sense of what these are. And they're just delightful. They appeal to adults as well as children. And we have the show up now at the Stanton Center down on Custom House Plaza, right by Fisherman's Wharf in Monterey, and it's fascinating to just watch people as they move through the exhibit, and they will sit themselves down in front of one and just study it for 10, 15 minutes and get absorbed in it. There's so much information. They're so lovely.
Yeah. And I can do that with a very standard map and get lost in the map for 10 or 15 minutes. But to imagine here's somebody who used to create comic strips for newspapers and illustrations for news stories, and not to mention, having been a sculptor. So the way he really brings the mapping of whatever he's showing to life is a different dimension than we're used to. It's certainly much better than anything you would call a commercial map. It's a work of art.
Absolutely. No, they are completely works of art, and lovely, gorgeous, fascinating, and you even, when you go back and look again, you always find something you didn't really notice the last time. And I have the Carmel one hanging in my bedroom, and, I've spent like an hour just looking at it, and still I see things, with repeated viewings that I didn't catch before.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously he traveled quite a bit in the United States. What were some of his influences in that, do you think?
Well, I think, as a sculptor, his father, certainly, and he led a fascinating life. He moved out west and to Mountain View, California.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he spent...
And back then it really was a Mountain View place.
Yeah, there was nothing.
Yeah.
I grew up in Mountain View.
Yeah.
And but back then, turn of the century, 1900 or so, there not much there. And then he decided he lived for 3 years on the Hobie Reservation.
Mm-hmm. And
I think he was heavily influenced by that experience. They accepted him as an outsider into their world, into their community. He learned the language. He also learned Navajo language.
Wow.
They allowed him to sketch them, to photograph them, which is highly unusual.
Yeah.
And
especially with the Hopi.
They trusted him.
Yeah.
And he did not betray their trust. And so I think, that experience, played into his later art making. And then he was recognized as a genius, really, and invited to join the Bohemian Club, in San Francisco. And so being in that milieu, I'm sure that influenced him. But to me, there are certain artists that you look at a work and you just know who did it. They have a signature look and style, and Mora is one of those. He has a unique look to his work, and It's hard to, beyond those comments, hard to really, get into his head and know exactly, what his influences were. But I get the sense that there was a strong inner child in him his whole life. He seemed, all the accounts of him, a delightful person, very fun to be around. And I get the sense of that inner child.
Yeah, that sense of wonder.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and the exhibit is up now at Stanton Center, right?
It is, yeah.
And how long is it going to be there?
Well, for at least a year.
All right.
Yeah, Monterey History and Art, we're a small nonprofit, and, we have the Stanton Center, and in terms of curating it and changing out the exhibits, we move pretty slowly. And so we'll have it up for at least a year.
Yeah, that's great. That means we actually have time to get there and see it. That's
yeah, so it's the sort of thing that, I mean, if listeners enjoy art, I have my bias, but I'm just, without my bias, it's worth, like, if you're in the Monterey region, it's worth a stop just for that exhibit. But there's plenty of other wonderful exhibits up as well. As I like to say, there's not a clunker on the album. Every bay, it's a great exhibit now.
That's
and
great.
You can walk out of there with a much better sense both of our history as well as our artistic heritage.
Wonderful. So in addition to the current exhibit, you're having a gathering on the weekend of October 5th and 6th to celebrate Jo Mora's work. What's going to be happening at the gathering?
Yeah, so the gathering is going to be a blast. And it's mostly Peter Hiller's brainchild. Peter is a wonderful person and a 100% Jo Mora advocate. And I think, he's been dreaming of doing this for some time. And so we're kind of partners in crime right now in terms of planning for this. But the weekend itself will be phenomenal. It'll start out on Saturday from 9 to 3:30 with a symposium where we have 4 of the 5 world experts on Jo Mora, all under one roof. They'll be giving presentations about different aspects of his art making. So Peter's going to talk about sculpture. There's a gentleman named Joss Grando who lives in Idaho who has the world's largest Jo Mora book collection. And so he's either written or illustrated. Joe wrote 2 full books. So he was an author as well as a book illustrator. And so Joss is going to speak to the books. We have Terry Alberg, who lives in Nevada, is an overall Mora expert, but particularly with the maps or carts, and he'll be involved. Terry Trotter, who runs the Trotter Gallery in Pacific Grove. His wife, Paula, runs the one in Carmel. Terry's going to be giving a talk about a particularly famous mural that the Trotters now own, called the Celebration of Pan, which used to hang in a restaurant called Fable's Restaurant in San Francisco for many decades.
Wow.
And it kind of goes on and on. Neil Hoteling, who's well-known down on the Monterey area as the Pebble Beach Company historian and archivist, and he's written a column for many years for the Pinecone, the Carmel Pinecone, also on history. He'll be talking about Sam Morse and Jo Mora and their relationship. And then, other people talking about saddles. And so it's going to be a wide-ranging, wonderful symposium. And I think everybody's going to learn so much. Like, I'm really looking forward to it. Just being a sponge. I'll be the MC, so I can't be too much of a sponge. I have to keep things moving. But, just soaking it all in terms of all of the insights that these different speakers are going to share. So then once the symposium is over, we go right into a reception for the cart exhibit, which will be fun. And we're going to pull some materials out of our archive that are related to the maps or carts that are not on display. We'll just bring them out for an hour and a half, and they're too fragile to have part of a permanent display. But have them out, explain to the participants what they're about. Then Sunday, You get a morning at ease, but then from 1 to 4, we'll have Casa Serrano open, which is an old adobe that's also part of Monterey history and art. And we've had a Jo Mora room in that building for decades.
Oh.
And a combination of drawings, watercolors, some oil paintings, several sculptures, and several of the carts and other items as well, photographs. Mora created the cenotaph, as it's called, for Junipero Serra at the Carmel Mission in 1925. That's what brought him here from Mountain View, was that commission. And so there's photographs of that in there. So we'll be giving a presentation. It's a little inside baseball, but the history of the building of that collection, and which is really interesting.
Yeah.
And then we finish at Terry Trotter's gallery in Pacific Grove, where he's going to do what we call a walkabout. He's got loads of Mora material in his gallery/museum in Pacific Grove. And so he's just going to walk around for 45, 50 minutes and talk about 15 to 20 items that are in his vast collection. And that will be in 2 groups, so people can have a good experience with it and not be tripping over each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, for listeners who maybe have just tuned in, my guest is Scott Gale. He's on the board of the Monterey History and Art Association, and he's the curator of the Jo Mora Cartographer exhibit, currently on display at the Stanton Center on Custom House Plaza in Monterey. So all these collections of Jo Mora's work, they're in the area because Jo Mora moved to the area, right?
Right. So yeah, Mora, he moved to the Monterey Peninsula in the mid-1920s, and then lived out the rest of his life there. He died in 1947. He had based on the photography, just a fabulous studio in Pebble Beach, where he could do really large format works. And so there'll be some photographs of his old studio in one of the presentations. And I just marvel at it. I'm a physician, and so the art world is a bit foreign to me in a sense. And I'm familiar with one studio of my grandfather, who was a illustrator and a fine artist. And it's, he's working relatively small format. And then to, look at the quote unquote studio of Jo Mora, where the ceilings must have been 20 feet high.
Wow.
And just vast support structures to be able to do large vertical murals. It's odd, that you attach the word studio to both of these sorts of structures, because they're just so different. Because what's happening, it's like, calling a 18-wheeler and a VW Bug vehicles.
Yes, right. Or a Great Dane and a Chihuahua dogs.
Yes, right? Exactly.
That's all art studios. No problem. Yeah. So, and you mentioned your grandfather, Donald Teague. He was a very prolific illustrator, and I wasn't familiar with him before we connected. And I in looking at his drawings and paintings, the images that were available online, I was really struck by his ability to capture facial expressions and actions, and to create like realistic scenes with lots of people where every person in the scene looks like a really distinct individual with like motivations, and there's something going on, like there's a dynamic tension. It's really quite beautiful work, and in a way I've kind of saying, it's a shame it was all just for magazine. I mean, it wasn't all just for magazine illustrations, but a lot of it was. Okay. And to me it's like, wow, this is really well done. I mean, extremely well done. So anyway, could you tell us a little bit more about your grandfather Donald Teague's work?
Oh, sure, I'd be delighted to. But first of all, just to your point, the illustrations, the whole genre to me is fascinating because, especially from the Golden Era, we had so many good illustrators. And like with Teague, let me back up. Oftentimes, illustrators were considered second-tier artists relative to fine artists. They were, quote unquote, commercial, and versus the fine artist, not being under those constraints. To me, I look at Teague and his ilk, and while they were illustrating, they had 1 foot and 4 toes in the fine art world, and brought that sensibility to the illustrations. And but it's a funny thing. It's like, so Teague would work on these illustrations for the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's, and he was kind of a rock star back in the day. And he'd send these illustrations in, and they'd get published, and like 3 million copies would go out to 4 million copies of the Post or Collier's to various households and institutions. And how many fingers, how many hands touched each magazine, hard to say.
Yeah.
But like probably, 10, 15, 20 million people would see the illustration. And then poof, they're just forgotten.
Right.
And the illustrations,
next month's issue.
yeah, no, the illustrations, they were kind of used like advertising for a story. To give something that would draw the reader in, to get them interested in the story, right?
Yeah.
And so to me, it's an area of our artistic history as Americans that deserves much greater exploration. And I had Teague was my main COVID sanity project. I was going nuts with the lockdown within a few months.
Oh, yeah.
Like all I could do was go hike, and so I was looking around for a good meaty project, and I decided to do a super deep dive into his career, starting with the illustrations. And I once our libraries opened up, I found like 525 stories so far that he illustrated, where each of these might have 1 to 3 illustrations in it.
Yeah.
And so I was able to, for one artist, really generate the complete picture of all their work, which is unusual. I mean, people like Norman Rockwell and maybe a couple others, there's complete lists and inventories of everything that they did. For most of the illustrators, they've been kind of forgotten. And, there's a couple on the internet or something like that, but you really don't get a sense of what they did.
Yeah, and it's real art. It's not, I think a lot of us, well, especially anybody over 50 probably remembers having an old hardcover book of, say, Treasure Island or something. And the illustrations in those were like the heart of it almost, because they were so beautifully done. All these books that had, it might be only 3 or 4 or a half dozen illustrations in the whole book, and yet they brought the whole story alive in a way that, if there hadn't been there, it would have been a good story, and it wouldn't have been the same. And I think we undervalue how much those illustrations contributed, especially in these, kind of magazine contexts where it's short fiction that's, usually being illustrated, or a story that's not exactly news, like a human interest story or something like that.
Yeah, and
it's
like, I think, Len, you and I are old enough to realize that, times change, right?
Yes.
And to put it mildly. And, so we're in the digital age now, right? And the advent of, and the wide usage of photography really, drove a nail in the coffin of the magazines, some of the magazines, period, like Collier's.
Yeah. And
certainly with the illustrators. And there are illustrators today working digitally or old school, but just the apparatus, it's not there anymore the way it was back in the day. And it's been a fascinating project to me, like just to realize, I went through all these old magazines from the 20s through the 50s, brute force, just turning pages. So I got to see like all of our illustrators. And you see just the arc of history, things that you forget about, like, back in the 20s, you had radio,
yeah,
no television yet.
right.
That came after World War II, really. And you had books, newspapers, and magazines, and then movies. Initially silent, and then eventually you had the talkies, right?
Right.
And versus all of the options that we have today for information and entertainment and whatnot.
Yeah.
It's
an explosion of media. Really.
yeah, no, it's good and kind of incredible. But it's always good to remember our roots also.
Yeah, and it is part of, I think, sort of the cultural milieu of the United States, that a lot of the stories that Donald Teague illustrated were like, I'll call them cowboy stories or Western stories, much of which, I'm not trying to demean the authors at all here, but just that a lot of that was very mythologized. It didn't correspond very closely to the reality of what really was happening in many cases. And it's part of our, I grew up with that mythology of, the Western frontier and cowboys versus Indians and, silver bullets and the whole 9 yards. And it's myth. It's not, certainly there are some parallels to reality, but it's not the full story. But these were a lot of the stories that your grandfather got to illustrate.
Right.
And he does such beautiful work in terms of capturing, that sort of, just people standing around a fire, like, what does that look like? And any of us who ever stood around a fire with our friends or coworkers or whatever circumstance it might be, there's a certain air that comes onto that. And I felt like he could capture simple scenes like that in such an elegant way. And I think that, that's really just underscores the talent that he had and the real artistry that was in there.
Well, to that point, there was a famous illustrator named Dean Cornwell. When he died, he was widely called the Dean of American Illustration. Yeah? And Cornwell was Teague's main influence. And Teague often quoted Cornwell that the role of the illustrator is to take a scene that they personally may have never seen or witnessed and make the reader believe that it is standing before them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, Teague took that to heart. One thing that I really love about his illustrations is the authenticity. It feels real. It feels legit. Now,
Yes.
Granted, these are works of art. It's not a photograph or whatever, but
Mm-hmm.
you feel like you're there.
Yeah.
And
I definitely got that, looking at that.
And to the individual faces, and not just kind of blurring, abstracting out the lesser characters or whatever, and they tell a story. The illustrations tell a story. They're not static; they're dynamic.
Yeah, definitely. And his work is not on exhibit right now anywhere in this area, right?
No, not in this area.
Yeah, but can listeners find it if they were to go online? Is that something that's accessible?
Yeah, sure. I actually have a non-commercial website going for him.
Great.
It's just his name, Donald Teague, Teague, and then NA for National Academy .com. And I've got, 400 or 500 illustrations posted. And then in the fine art section, so far it's just works of the Monterey Peninsula and Western fine art.
Yeah, because he was also a resident of Carmel, right?
He was, yeah. No, he moved to Carmel in 1949 and died there in 1991, December.
Yeah. Wow. All right. Well, I want to go a little bit more into this story about Donald Teague, but we're going to take a really short break, and we'll be right back in just a couple minutes. Don't go away. Well, you're listening to Talk of the Bay on the Squid here, and I'm your host, Len B.A. If you're just tuning in, my guest is Scott Gale. Scott is on the board of the Monterey History and Art Association. He is the curator of the Jo Mora Cartographer exhibit, which is currently on display at the Stanton Center on Custom House Plaza in Monterey. And he is part of the planning for the upcoming Jo Mora Gathering weekend to be held October 5th and 6th in Monterey. So we'll get into how you can find out more about that if you've missed the first half of the show. But we were talking about Scott's grandfather, Donald Teague, who was a very prolific illustrator and fine artist, and we were just having sort of follow-on conversation there. I had made a comment that I felt like there's a lot of mythology around the cowboy character in American history, and particularly I think we see that in film. But of course, Donald Teague did a lot of illustrations for stories that were cowboy stories, and they are truly beautiful illustrations. If you go to donaldteaguena.com, is that right? You can see some of those illustrations, which are truly impressive. But Scott, you were saying something about the people who put these stories together and tried to recreate a history of the cowboy era, if I could call it that.
Yeah, so in my research, if you will, I kind of distinguish between the authors and the illustrators that were actually there during the Old West versus those that came later and were, to some degree, writing through the rearview mirror about things that they never saw themselves. And so I think, and Teague was illustrating in that era, people that were writing about the Old West and, the Indian War period and whatnot through the rearview mirror. And I think the good authors, they did their best to be accurate. For example, Zane Grey had a vast library. I think it was 15,000 books, all about the West. So he was trying his best to be accurate. Another author that's kind of forgotten today, Ernest Haycock, 17,000 books, all about the Old West. Louis L'Amour, he passed more recently, vast library. And so they took this very seriously. Then there's others, I will mention one name. There's a guy named Max Brand that I've read a couple of his Westerns, and they're just kind of trashy. There's very little accuracy going on. They're just plot driven and very, black and white, good and bad. And and I think with in my mind, the mythology aspect of it, I see it more in the movies, really. Mm-hmm. They're a little bit on the propaganda side almost, programming us to a certain worldview about the conquering of the West, if you will.
Yeah. And that's really what I had in mind. I think was really more what I witnessed growing up in an era when cowboy movies were kind of the bread and butter of not just movie theaters, but television. A lot, as you said, I've read enough of Zane Grey and at least one other author who really did have much more nuanced presentation of what could be real lives, like you get that feeling of real characters and real lives and dealing with the dynamics that they had to deal with.
Well, just to give you an example, The Searchers was written by Alan LeMay, 1954, published. And, it's about the slaughter of a family by Comanche. But LeMay, the Comanche had their reason to be there. And LeMay gets into that. I don't know, with the movie, I don't think it made it into the movie why the Comanche were trying to even the score. But they, nobody was pure.
Right. No, and the Comanche are renowned even among neighboring tribes as being particularly volatile, let's say, to put it mildly. Yeah.
And so, in a more long-form novel, which he was based on the abduction of Cynthia Ann Parker and a different story of the finding of the abductee. Mm-hmm. There was a lot, even though it's fiction, there's a lot of historical events that are woven into that one, and very nuanced presentation.
Yeah. And that's a whole other piece of history just by itself. We know, we talk about the conquest of the West. In a lot of places, it was pretty summarily complete in a relatively short time. But the area that the Comanches had as their sort of natural range, being primarily bison hunters for their subsistence, they had a huge area, and they were one of the early tribes to be early adopters of horses, which got to them before they'd ever seen any white people, and they were amazing horse people, and they kept colonization from advancing for many decades.
Right.
They were very difficult to conquer. So it's almost a unique piece of history. Well, as the story of the counter with any tribe is really unique. Well, so Donald Teague was this great illustrator who was your grandfather, but you didn't actually know he was your grandfather until you were, was it 28 years old?
Yeah.
Could you tell that story?
Yeah, sure. So I was actually adopted at birth. I was adopted out of the Teague family and raised, they were based in Carmel. I was raised in Mountain View on the peninsula by my parents, Joyce and Don, and I had not a clue who the Teagues were. I didn't know them from Adam until I was almost 29 years old. And it's really an incredible story. So I was in my residency training at UC San Francisco in my third year of training, and I just kept pushing and pushing. I wanted to be a doctor from a young age, and so went right through high school, college, med school, in my third year of residency, and I felt like Wile E. Coyote, that I had just like run off a cliff, and my little legs were going, and there was like nothing underneath me anymore. So
Wow.
for the second time in my life, I brought up with my mom about wanting to know more about my biologic background. And her jaw dropped. And she reached into her purse and said, I have something for you. I cut this out 10 days ago, not knowing what to do with it. But in light of what you said, I want you to have this. This is the obituary for your biologic grandfather. And I just happened to catch it in the San Jose Mercury. My mom Joyce was not an obituary reader, but she knew what it meant. And if you read down, Linda, who lives in Los Angeles, is your biologic mother. And so I, pocketed this and took it back to my apartment in San Francisco. And Linda and I met like a week later. I'll never forget it. It was at San Francisco airport. It was New Year's Eve day,
Wow.
1991. And this was back before TSA and everything, so you could just walk out to the gate and meet people.
Oh, yeah.
And so she was flying in at like 4:30 in the afternoon from LA on United, and I'm sitting there at the gate. And the entire plane empties, and she's not come off. And then there's like a 2-minute break, and then a very elegant, poised, beautiful woman came down solo down the jetway, and I just took one look. I'm like, that's her. I look just like her. And so we went on to become great friends. And that's, once I met Linda, I quickly learned about, the biologic background with her dad and Linda's sister Hillary, who with her husband Ken and their son Brian live in San Francisco. Hillary's deceased now. So it was, kind of a whole new world was opened up to me. And as I learned more about, I've got to know Linda and learned more about, Teague and the family history. It kind of, it answered some questions for me in terms of my aptitudes and my drive and whatnot.
Yeah.
So it was a very settling experience for me. But I'm glad that it happened when I was 28, almost 29, and not when I was a kid. It might have confused me quite a bit if I was 10 or 12 or something.
Yeah, because by then you're an independent adult.
Yeah, I was pretty fully formed at that point. I, was a physician and had a, kind of a set identity, set course in life, and so it was additive to my life. It was not confusing in any way.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's and there I've heard a number of stories of people who were adopted, either in their, infancy or in their toddlerhood, and I've never heard a story like that where you actually get to, find out who your biological family was at that age. That just to have that sense of completion.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I'm 61 now, and it really did provide us that completion. And, I know about the biologic father also, and we've not really met. And he's not interested, and I respect that. It takes two to tango, right? And
Yes.
so you have to have two willing parties, the biologic parent and the progeny. But
Right.
in my case, it was just wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel so blessed that. Well, and I ultimately salute my mother Joyce, who she only just selfishly stood to lose in this deal. I mean, what if I all of a sudden started, romanticizing my bio mom Linda and identifying with her and forgot about Joyce, and that would never happen. My mom trusted me, and I know who raised me, who put in the hard work. That's my mom.
Right.
And it's not, who gave birth to me.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. So, as being on the board of Monterey History and Art, you've curated other shows before. You curated a show at the Stanton Center about Salvador Dali's 1941 party at the old Hotel Del Monte. And I was wondering, what was Dali doing in Monterey in 1941? What was that party like?
Well, that it's just nuts, honestly. So Dali fled Europe at the beginning of World War II. Mm-hmm. And he somehow, he landed in New York initially. I'm not sure what brought him out to California, other than that there were a lot of connections to be made in Los Angeles, in the art world. But once he saw Monterey, it reminded him of the Figueras area in the northernmost east corner of Spain, Cadaqués and that area where he lived. And so he felt an affinity for the Monterey Peninsula once he saw it. And so he kind of, it's, who initiated it, the idea of this party is hard to say. Probably it came from the Hotel Del Monte side as a PR opportunity.
Sure.
But Dali was certainly a willing participant in it, and the idea was to hold a fundraiser for other struggling European artists that were either trying to flee Europe and didn't have funds, or had landed stateside here but didn't have funds. And so what was called the Party of the Century for several decades after it occurred was held in Monterey at the Hotel Del Monte in September of 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor. And it's hard to describe in words, really. It's better described in pictures than in words what this party was like. But they basically took a vast room and turned it into a grotto in a forest, populated with animals, both imaginary, like animal heads on mannequins, and alive. They borrowed 17 animals from the Fleischacker Zoo.
Wow.
And
oh, wow.
They had a lion. I mean, it's insane. We would never even think to do this today.
Right.
It's like, but they thought differently back then. So they had a lion cub on Dali's wife's lap. She was in a bed and eating her meal in a bed
of course,
at this
there's
party.
a bed at the party.
Yeah, a gigantic bed, like a king, California king times 4.
Right.
And she's laid out in this thing with this lion cub on her lap, and
Wow.
it's just insane. Like, who would, other than Dali, who would think of this?
A surreal event. And
Yeah,
I'm sure there was no drinking going on or anything like that.
Absolutely not. No. At this establishment, I'm shocked. No,
Wow, that must have been
it looked. I
amazing.
mean, the photos, people. that kind of got into the spirit of it. It was zany. It was just insane. One course was live frogs served on plates. So the waiter would lift the metal, the covering
Oh, yes,
thing.
those covers on
And
the
there's like 3 frogs and they'd start jumping off the plate. Like, just crazy.
Yeah.
So anyways,
dessert for the mind, really.
we have a really interesting exhibit up now about that party where there's 9 large black and white photos and then 8 panels that accompany it. That one is written by Neil Hoteling about Dolly's time in Monterey, and he actually did some important work here. His whole kind of atomic phase, his reaction to the dropping of the bombs in Japan, started here. And a panel on Samuel F.B. Morse, who he was the president of the Del Monte Properties Company, and just what that man controlled back in the day. It was like all of Pacific Grove, all of Pebble Beach, 11,000 acres in Carmel Valley, and all the water to the whole Monterey Peninsula.
Wow.
It was a vast, and the hotel.
Yeah.
And the more I've learned about Morse, and that panel is written by his grandson, Charlie Osborne, the more I learn, the more I'm thankful, because he didn't want the area to get ruined by development. And so the reason we don't look like Miami is because of Morse.
Yeah, just a little restraint.
Yeah, and I'm just like, every time, there's so many, roads named after Morse and other things down there. And every time I see one, I just kind of tip the cap, like, thank you for interceding and not letting happen to that area what happened to so many others. So, and then there's a panel about Herb Serwin, who was the PR guy, Julian Graham, who was the photographer, a panel about the hotel itself, and then some additional panels to kind of tell the rest of the story.
Yeah.
And even, people that enjoy the history will really enjoy it, because it gets a little bit into the weeds, not too much, but just enough. Right. And even those that don't, just the visuals of these photos are amazing.
I bet. And the Hotel Del Monte is now is the Naval Postgraduate School, right?
Right. Yeah. And
so that's a big building.
It's huge.
Yeah.
Now, I had an opportunity to tour it a couple months ago, and I thought of it as Hearst Castle of the North. It's so grand, so stately. It doesn't have all the objects in it that Hearst Castle does. A lot of those were taken out when the Navy took over the hotel, and I think it was 1952. They bought it. They kind of rented it for as a flight training school during World War II, and then decided to bring the postgraduate school here rather than have it in Annapolis in the early 50s. So they formally bought it all in 1952, I believe. So a lot of the objects were moved out, but there's still huge murals in there. They're just stunning.
Yeah.
And grand rooms, like Versailles type rooms. It's like the main dining room is like, oh my God, it's so huge.
Yeah. Wow.
And I say this, I feel like I'm a bit of a tease, because you have to have military credentials or know somebody with credentials to get in. So it's not like you can just drive up and go have a look. I think, up to like pre 9/11, you could. It was open to the public, and then with all the heightened security after 9/11, at some point they tightened things down there.
Yeah. Well, perhaps they will. Perhaps someone from there is listening, and they'll arrange to have an open house someday.
It would be wonderful if just
Armed Forces Day, why not?
Once or twice a year they invited the public in, to see it. It's really something.
Yeah. That's a great legacy. Well, in addition to your grandfather, Donald Teague, your great-grandfather, Harry Timmins, was also a top commercial and story illustrator. Could you tell us a little bit about Harry Timmins' life and work?
Yeah, sure. So, the art runs thick in my blood, as it turns out. So, Donald Teague married a woman named Verna Timmins, my biological grandmother. her dad was a powerhouse illustrator himself. So Harry Timmins was born in Kansas, artistically gifted, moved to Chicago as a young man, attended the Art Institute of Chicago for additional training. He worked as a commercial illustrator initially, and did like ads for automobiles like Cadillac and Buick and Pierce Arrow. Some of these brands are long gone, but and the Pierce Arrow ones from 1924 are just gorgeous. And he did ads for Hoover vacuums, and it just it goes on and on. And he had his own commercial agency. So companies from, and this was in Chicago, which was really the commercial illustration capital in the United States back then. And so companies would come in, they'd say what they'd want, and he had, a whole stable of different folks under his employ to make, whether it was the copy, for the ads, the layout, everything it took to, create a finished ad. And this was a going concern for quite some time. Then in 1923, he co-founded an art school, the American Academy of Art in Chicago, which is 100 years old this year or last year, and still a going concern. And I was, I didn't know much about it, and I figured, it must have ran second fiddle to the Art Institute in Chicago, the School of the Art Institute. And the more artists I talked to, the more I realized a lot of our really good living artists went through that school, and they loved it.
Yeah.
Because everybody that taught there was actually working. They were working artists, and so they had a lot of very practical input that they shared with students, not just theory.
Right.
So Timmins, the Great Depression hit, and ads just dried up. So he switched over to story illustration in the 30s, and continued to do that through the late 40s. Then he moved to L.A. and did movie posters in the 50s and early 60s, and did fine art, as well throughout all of these periods.
Yeah.
And
amazing.
Yeah.
That's great.
And his stuff is really interesting too. I like Teague's a little better, but Harry, it's like of an era, and it's much more nostalgic than the Teague, and but lovely also. So if people are like totally into this, I have a website going for Harry also. Harry Timmins, HarryTimmins.com, and there's a lot of the illustration work posted there. I'm kind of stalled out on the movies. It's hard to figure out which movie posters he did.
I bet they probably don't credit that through the movie industry. Yeah,
not often. Yeah.
Well, we have just about 30 seconds left, and I want to make sure our listeners know that the Jo Mora Cartographer exhibit is on now at the Stanton Center on Custom House Plaza in Monterey, and can you tell us hours, days that's open?
Yeah, so it's open every day but Wednesday, 12 to 4, and the price is $10 for adults. Children 17 and under are free. I try to be objective. I think it's worth the $10.
Yeah.
Well, might not have been a year ago, but it is now, and I think folks will love it.
Wonderful. Well, Scott, Gale, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being here.
It's been my pleasure, Len. Thank you.